The child free by choice as a segment of the population is growing. First question for you is what has surprised you the most in your research into this group?
Oh gosh, there's been a lot of things that have surprised me, but I'd say the number of people that are child free. When I started working on this with my collaborators, we thought it'd be in the neighborhood of 5, maybe pushing 10% of the population. And when we started collecting the data in Michigan and saw that it was closer to 20, 25%, we fell out of our chairs. We thought there was something wrong with the data, something had gotten messed up with the analysis, checked it again, collected new data, checked it again, collected new data, 4 waves of data in, we're still seeing the same thing. We're starting to see the same thing from other researchers. And so I think what's really surprised me and what's surprising a lot of people about this work is just how many people are child free. How many people out there are saying, I don't have kids and I don't want kids.
And I think it's important to point out that the age group you're studying is what?
So in some of our studies, we study the entire adult population. So 18 to, we've got some respondents that are 99. And, we think that's really interesting because we're even finding people who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s who said, I don't have kids because I never wanted kids. There are older child-free people out there that we never really knew existed because at the time that was not something somebody would be upfront about or disclose. So there are a lot of young child-free people out there. Certainly they sort of dominate these samples, but there are older child-free people out there too.
By some estimates, the portion of America's population categorized as child free by choice is as high as 25%. These people are defined as adults who have actively chosen not to become parents either biologically, through marriage, or through adoption. The ranks of the child free are growing, not just in this country, but worldwide. And Professor Zachary Neal of Michigan State University is one of the researchers focused on documenting and understanding that trend. On today's podcast, we are talking about the categories of adults from parents to not yet parents to the ambivalent to the childless despite trying to the child free by choice. Society is changing, but is that what we're seeing in these numbers? Or are we just finally seeing numbers that reveal the truth? What are our misconceptions about those who choose not to have children? And what do they say about us? Do the people who choose not to have children truly live to regret it later? And what does it mean for the country and the world when birth rates are plummeting while the aging are continuing to live longer? Stay tuned. Let's start with what is the definition of a person who's child free and why did you choose in the first place to study them?
The definitions are tricky in this space. So child-free people, at least as we define them in this work, are people who don't have biological or non-biological children. So no children of their own, but also no adopted children, no foster children, no stepchildren, and they don't want any biological or non-biological children in the future.
Mm-hmm.
And so child-free people are one kind of non-parent. And some of this work tries to understand this broad range of non-parents. So some non-parents are what we call not yet parents. They're not parents right now, but they want to become parents in the future.
Mm-hmm.
The real key distinction is between child-free and childless.
Mm-hmm.
For us, child-free people don't have children and they don't want children. Childless people don't have children, but
And
they
they want.
wanted to have children. And we think, frequently we use childless as sort of an umbrella term to mean anybody who doesn't have kids.
Yeah.
And we're trying to unpack that and say, no, there's different kinds of people who don't have kids. And what we've increasingly found is child-free people are really one of the largest groups of people who don't have kids. And that makes them a really interesting group to study.
So if we segment the adult population, there's parents, there's child free by choice, there's childless, not by choice, there's not yet parents, then there's the undecideds, and then there's the ambivalent. Meh. So there's technically 6 kind of categories of adults. You cited research that said 20 to 25% of adults in Michigan in your study were child free by choice. Does that apply across the US? And if so, like, if so, then do you have information on how that may have changed versus a generation ago?
It's really difficult to say how broadly it applies. So
Yeah.
what we've found is that different studies and different ways of asking people about how they feel about having kids give us different sorts of answers. So we've studied people in Michigan, and we've used a certain set of questions, and we get this 20 to 25% number. One of the largest national studies of fertility in the United States is the National Survey of Family Growth. And they primarily focus on women in childbearing ages, so 15 to 44. They put the percent of women who are child free at closer to 10%, quite a
Mm.
bit lower than the number that we see nationwide. We think there are differences in the way these studies ask people. So, for instance, in Michigan, we use an anonymous survey. But when the National Survey of Family Growth asks, they do a face to face interview.
Oh.
Typically, one woman asking another woman, do you want to have children?
Or
And
asking a 15-year-old child who may
exactly,
be thinking, of course, someone told me I'm going to have kids. I want, meanwhile, 10 years later, she could say, absolutely, categorically not.
exactly. And so we think these little differences in how the data gets collected are sort of driving these huge differences in percentages. So it's really difficult to say exactly how many child-free people there are in the United States. Um, but all of these surveys across, all the different states, different methods are all suggesting there's a substantial number, and it looks like it's going up.
Well, and what's interesting is you're averaging across generations through to someone who's 99. So I would assume your data to be more accurate. A 15-year-old isn't really even making an active choice about where they live or what they wear yet, you know? So let's just, like, let's temper our enthusiasm about that study. I looked at the 2021 Pew Research Center study, showing that 44% of non-parents between 18 and 49 don't think they will have children. That is up from 37% in 2018, 44% in 2021. So it's rising that quickly. More than half of them listed their main reason as, I just don't want children, rather than the more kind of circumstantial factors that I was talking about earlier, which sort of points to the idea that overall for the adult population, roughly 55% will become parents in some way, shape. 20% won't, but wanted to. And another almost 25% won't because they don't want to. We're focusing on that last 25%. In the US alone, of that 25%, the first half say they just don't want kids. The other half includes everything from medical reasons at 19%, financial reasons 17%, no partner 15%. The state of the world was 9%, climate change was 5%. So for all the reasons people cite anecdotally, they do show up in the data, but the largest single chunk is, I just don't want kids. What is your opinion about the biggest driver of the, call it 12.5% of people who say they simply don't want kids because they're not interested?
Yeah, that's a great question, and the Pew studies that you've mentioned have done a fantastic job asking people what's informing this decision, and is really, I think, one of the best sources of information we have. Um, I think people are increasingly recognizing that you don't have to be a parent. You can be a parent, and for the longest time, it was expected that everyone would become a parent. But there's increasing awareness that parenthood is a choice, especially as people see this research and realize there are a huge number of child-free people out there. It makes that choice, the validity of that choice, a little more visible. And so as people realize it's a choice they make, they don't need to have a reason to not be a parent. Now, some may have reasons, and often we'll hear people point to environmental concerns or political concerns or
Money.
yeah, money. There's
Money.
all kinds of there's lots of very good reasons someone might point to not want to have kids in the world we live in. But it's okay to not have a reason to.
I always knew that I would be happy to be a parent and I would be fine if I wasn't. I would have been the if it happens person. But I also had a template for what parenthood gives you that was very positive, right? That it is fulfilling, that there is a connective tissue between generations that provides one of those core satisfactions of life. and of the human experience, which, though you can live without, is quite wonderful to have, right? What would you say to someone who assumes that people who are child free by choice either one, had a terrible childhood, or two, have selfish tendencies?
Gosh, those are some of the most common sorts of stereotypes we hear
Uh-huh.
about child-free people. Um, we hear that they're selfish, self-centered. We sometimes hear that they're focused on their career. A classic one is that they have no responsibilities and are just sitting on mountains of cash. That
Mountains
they're
just rolling
mountains
around.
just rolling in the dough, or that they hate children. And
Right, right.
the big one also is that they're going to go down this path, and at the end of their life, they're going to look back and regret this decision. So
Hmm.
a whole bundle of stereotypes, and we see these about both men and women, although they're much more commonly voiced about child-free women.
Hmm.
Um, and so we've done a little bit of study about these sorts of stereotypes. Uh, we've tried to look at what sorts of people hold these stereotypes about
Mm.
child-free people. They mostly seem to not be accurate. So, we commonly hear people are going to regret their decision to be child-free. We see there's just no evidence to suggest that people have this sort of regret. So we looked at just the people who were 70 and older, and we'd asked them, looking back on your life, is there anything you'd change? The
Mm.
responses we got from the parents who were 70 and older were essentially identical to the responses we got from the child-free people that were 70 and older. Looking back, there are all kinds of things that might happen to us in our lives, and maybe we regret some of those things and maybe we don't, but it's not like the parents had fewer regrets than the child-free people.
Mm.
There's lots of variation, but being child-free does not seem to be driving regret, driving wishes that we'd done things differently.
Hearing you speak, it sounds like it was more likely that people would regret not having had children at a time when we died at 60. Because if you died at 60, you were just around, maybe you had your kids at 22, your kids had kids at 22, and then you got to see your grandchild as a fully formed human right around the time you died. There was not this whole extra inning of life. And these days we have this whole extra inning of life because people are going to live much, much longer, but also they have a different cadence to life. So it becomes a situation where the parenting part of life, although it's never over, but the active parenting part of life can be staged in at a point where it essentially ends and you do get to redefine. So at the end of your life, your primary role in life is not I was a father, or it's not I was a mother. I did all these things. One of those things was raising these children, which is a very different way kind of to look at it. For the record, I feel like there are tons of good reasons not to have kids. I want to say that, and I should have said that at the beginning of the podcast. Chief among them, I think it is more selfish to have children if you don't want to be a parent than it is to not have children. Because if you raise a child and you do not want that child will know. And it is so much work, even if you already want a child, that to put a child through that for some sort of performative benefit, I think is the actually actively selfish choice. And what if you're actually making a great choice for that child that doesn't have to exist in a home where it's not really wanted? Or given the attention that it deserves. So, with the caveat that it's perfectly valid not to want to be a parent, do you think fewer people crave the satisfaction of the parent child connection now than they did a generation ago?
Gosh, that's one of I think the million-dollar questions in looking at these trends. And we see in our data these numbers are going up, and we really see it around the world. The number of child-free people are going up in almost every country we've looked at. The thing that's hard to know is, are those numbers going up because more people are choosing not to have children? Or are they going up because people finally feel comfortable admitting that they don't want to have children? And these people that we see as child-free today were the people that a generation ago said, well, maybe in the future, or I'm thinking about it, and now they say, no, I don't want to have children.
Right.
And so it's possible that there have always been a huge chunk of the world that didn't want children, and it's only now that they're saying so, and we can sort of recognize that position.
So the billion-dollar question is, what has changed? The answer is there's no answer because a lot has changed, and that may not be the reason, right?
I think you're right that there's so much that's changed. It's difficult to put a pin on any single thing. One of the big things I think that could drive this trend that we know has changed is that it's increasingly possible for people to decide when they have children,
For sure. Yeah. Yeah.
both men and women. And we think that this control over a reproductive decision is driving this in part because when those abilities are challenged, we also see these numbers move. So this was something we looked at very closely in the United States
Mm.
immediately after the repeal of the Roe versus Wade protections over rights to abortion. And in that immediate aftermath, when it became sort of very unclear, very chaotic, to what extent people would have control over their reproductive lives, we saw the number of people saying they were child free go up quite dramatically.
Really?
Uh, we think because, when people have the freedom to choose, they're open to considering being parents. But when those freedoms are taken away, there's sort of a retreat and a thinking, it's too risky. I'm going to pump the brakes on parenthood.
Wow.
And so we think reproductive rights and the ability to choose is one of the big things that drives some of these trends that we're seeing.
That is fascinating. You know what it makes me wonder? Was there a spike in vasectomies?
There
In
absolutely was
really?
a spike in vasectomies immediately after the Dobbs decision, but continuing spikes in vasectomies. Vasectomies are going through the roof for the last 4 years, year over year. More vasectomies have been performed than ever before. So
Really?
very, very common. There was an additional spike following the recent US presidential election.
Wow.
It's much harder to see spikes in voluntary female sterilization procedures, not necessarily because they're not being requested, but because doctors will often refuse to perform them, which is a real problem. Again, returning to these sort of stereotypes that women don't know what's good for them, they'll regret this decision later, and so when a woman requests a sterilization procedure, the doctor will tell them, come back in 10 years after you're older and can think about this more clearly.
It's infuriating. And as a woman who is a mother and is happy to be a mother, it is infuriating. I saw a video with a relatively young woman. I feel like she was maybe 22, and she was documenting her process of going through trying to get her tubes tied and the number of doctors who talked to her as if she were 12. And it's infuriating that she's not in charge of her own body in that way. Also, really, really fascinating to me that there's been a spike in vasectomies because it just goes to show you how nobody likes it when their control over their body is taken away, do they? Nobody likes it. Let's talk about other countries. So, given the signaling of countries like Japan, where birth rates have been declining the most, what are some of the most important public policy items that you think need to change to accommodate the growth of the child free by choice?
Mhm.
Make a
I mean, most of the public policy we see, and especially you mentioned Japan in countries with these falling birth rates, are public policies designed to try and encourage people to have more children.
Hmm.
And as we see the number of people who are child free increase, there's a chance that those kinds of public policies might be really harmful because it could lead people who don't want kids to have kids anyway because their government
Hmm.
is telling them to. So I suppose one public policy is to stop implementing public policies encouraging people to have children whether they want to or not. I certainly am sympathetic to countries with declining birth rates, declining populations,
Right.
seeing their cultures, their histories change, but asking people who don't want children to have children is probably not a good strategy for those people and for the children that they would have and potentially not want.
Well, I thought
Um,
you were going to go in another direction and say the public policy change should be um, to reimagine care for the aging, given that people, many, many people are going to be aging without next of kin. If you have no children and you're Siblings are gone and your parents are gone and you're not that close with that one weird cousin you had who's making your medical decisions, right? So and families are very fractured to begin with in this country.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. But I'm not sure that that's really an issue for the child free in particular, because even most parents are not cared for by next of kin, by their children. So we frequently hear people ask of the child free, who's going to take care of you when you're old? And, frequently this response is the same people who will take care of parents when they're old. Medical professionals will do this. So
That's
I think
depressing.
at
Yeah.
end of life care, yeah, these sorts of they're incredibly important, but this is going to be important for parents too.
Well, here's the distinction, and I will say this because I know one day my children will listen to all my podcasts, read all my books, do everything they've told me they're going to do all this stuff. What I say to them is this: I don't want you to ever take care of me, but I damn well want you to want to. That's the relationship I'm looking for. I want to take a step back. Why do you do this work?
Um, when I started doing the work, it was just sort of an academic curiosity, but the reasons for keeping up with the work have sort of shifted. As we've started sharing some of our findings, when we share this research in the media, on podcasts, I'll frequently get emails from child-free people who said, I thought I was the only one. I thought I was really weird. And
Oh.
reading your studies just like me makes me feel like I'm not alone. And that doesn't happen for any of the other research I do. And it's made me realize that, this sort of numbers counting people demographic research actually changes the way people feel about their own decision. But it
Hmm.
also speaks to people who are sort of undecided and helps them realize if they choose to be child free, they will not be alone. They will not be weird. Either choice they make, they're going to join an enormous group of other people who have made the same choice. And so I think that's what's really exciting about this work, is that it speaks to a huge group of people that often think they're alone, but really are not.
That sounds really satisfying because as an academic and as a researcher, I imagine you don't get that kind of feedback very often. I'm asking you a lot of questions as if you are a philosophical authority because when someone's immersed in the data and the research, they can't help but kind of absorb it and think about it and have these conversations with far more people than the average person would. I was looking at the impact on society of lower birth rates combined with the growing ranks of the elderly. I saw a chart that said the birth rates per 1,000 women aged 15 to 45 showed that globally it's about 2.3 births per thousand, and that is above the replacement rate. The replacement rate for the human population is 2.1. But interestingly, that's because it's averaging 5 births per woman in African countries, and it's as low as 1.6 in the US and zero point 0.8 in some of the Asian countries, including Japan. So the conclusion is that in general, it really is the developed countries where this is a trend. We could assume that this has something to do with that element of choice. But we could also make the argument that this is not what progress was intended for, because for the human race to shrink is not the goal. Have you done any research or any predictive modeling into how large the ranks of the child free can get before it becomes a problem for society en masse? Not morally, but for the functioning of this society.
Yeah, so there certainly are a number of groups that are thinking about this. This is a much bigger conversation about what the appropriate number of people is for the earth and the resources and the society. And some people advocate, at least a replacement birth rate, that society needs to continue growing for the human race to continue to exist. Others suggest that there are far too many of us even now, and a
Hmm.
decline in the global population of people would be good for the environment, would be good for society, would be good for almost everything except the economy. Uh, it's possible that society would continue to go on just fine with fewer people once we solve the sort of aging situation, the end of life care. So I think it's a difficult question. People are, very reasonable people making arguments on both sides of this. I think it's going to be something that becomes increasingly more relevant. Mentioned the developing world, and we've just started to look at child-free trends in the developing world,
Oh.
where there are essentially no child-free people. That child-free people are incredibly uncommon in, say, sub-Saharan Africa, in
Mhm.
Southeast Asia, uh, partly because the birth rates have been very high for millennia, partly because access to birth control is very limited.
Mm.
And there's enough data now where we can actually see the number of child-free people increasing even in these developing countries. And what we're particularly interested in understanding is what is it going on in those countries that makes it possible for there to be more child-free people now than there were before. And it seems to be the same sorts of forces that we see in developed countries. It's access to medical care, it's access to education. When schools exist and women are allowed to attend them, they increasingly choose not to have children or to delay having children. And so I think what it really boils down to in every country is when people have the ability to choose,
Mm.
some of them choose not to have children. We only see these sort of very high birth rates when people don't have the ability to choose otherwise. And so, I think it's on balance a good thing when people can choose what kind of life they want to live. If people want to have parents, want to have children,
If
that's
you want to have
fantastic.
parents,
Everybody gets parents. We all get parents whether
you
we
may
want
not
to or
want to
not.
have the parents you got,
Exactly.
but nobody gets to
That
choose whether they had parents.
that's a whole other podcast. So if people want to have children, that's fantastic. We
If
should
you're
do
doing research
everything as
on
a
that, we should
society.
do that podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. So if people want to have children, they should, and we should do everything as a society to support them in being parents, and those children have a great experience. But if people don't want to have children, we need to do everything as a society to support that choice too.
What other areas of research are you focused on now around this question? What are the key questions you're asking?
Yeah. So the one burning question that I've been wondering, my colleagues have been wondering about since the beginning, is what happens to the social relationships of child-free people and parents over time? What do their social networks look like? Because as child-free people get older, a lot of their friends turn into parents.
Mm-hmm.
And when people become parents, they become friends primarily with other parents. And so,
Mm-hmm.
what we're really interested in is what happens to the social networks of people who are child free and stay child free over that, you know, 25 to 40 range when a lot of their friends who didn't have kids become parents.
Oh.
What does that sort of transition look like? Are we looking at the ushering in of loneliness among a bunch of
Mm-hmm.
child-free people in their late 40s? Or
Mm-hmm.
do their social networks adapt? Or do they, keep parents in their social networks and that interaction just looks a little different? We don't really know anything about this.
Mm.
But I think that's really interesting.
That is, and also, does being partnered make a difference? Because is loneliness more a factor in midlife of not having children and someone to pass on, or is it more a factor of not having an adult to bear witness to yours?
It'd be great to come back once I can tell you a little more about what folks' social networks look like when they choose to have kids or not.
Well, there was someone I interviewed recently on the podcast, Anna Goldberg. She wrote a book called Modern Friendship. She was the New York Times friendship correspondent, quote unquote. And she wrote a book about how friendship is changing. And she says we lose on average half our friendships every 7 years. It was not like that 25 years ago. You were embedded in a social structure where you couldn't leave. You couldn't get rid of those friends if you wanted to. But there is something interesting happening in our definition of connection and how that relates to loneliness. Um, Usually I do a lightning round of questions with people, but with you, I wanted to ask, we have defined the categories of adults. There are parents, there are childless, there are child free by choice, there are ambivalent, there are not yet parents. Where do you fall?
I'm sometimes reluctant to answer it and sometimes not. Um, I'm child free, but I think it's worth explaining why I'm sometimes reluctant to answer it.
Yeah,
And
why?
it's related to the research. So it's not that I don't want to own the identity of being child free. It's about my perceived relationship to the research. So if I identify as child free, there's a
Oh,
risk that some will say, well, you're just studying yourself. Uh, and I think it's important to point out that most people are parents,
Yeah,
including most demographers who study parents are parents.
right.
We all fit in one of these categories somewhere. Uh, I happen to be in the child-free category. I've chosen not to have children. We all bring biases to
Right.
research in the same way that parents might bring parent-related biases to demographic research on parents that they
And I
do.
bring it
So,
to this podcast.
of course. So,
Of
you
course.
know, I that's why I've been reluctant in the past to sort of own that identity in the context of the research. But I
Yeah.
think it really all boils down to being clear about the work we do. One of the things that's been really important to us in sharing this research is that we also always share the data
Hmm.
because we want to see more people studying this population, and we want to be transparent about what we've found and what we're doing. Uh, and so I really think it's being upfront about potential biases, but also being upfront about where the data comes from and sort of really where everything I've told you today has come from.
Yeah. Well, I think if there are any conclusions to today's talk, it reminded me of a conversation I had with a male friend who was getting married maybe 5 years ago. And he said his fiance wanted to have a child and he was on the fence. And he asked me, "You're a mom. What do you think? Should I have a child?" I said, "Well, I'll put it this way. If if you are considering having children, how much ever work you think it is to be a parent, it's 5 times harder. How much ever joy you think you'll get from your children, it's 25 times as much. With that said, there are a lot of other sources of joy in your life. So if you want to be a parent, be a parent. And if you don't, definitely don't."
That seems like sound advice for almost any sort of life decision. Somebody might, if you want to do it and you're really committed, do it. And that could be
Mhm.
having a kid, could be getting married, it could be changing jobs.
Yeah.
And if you don't want to do it, that's okay too.
And the
Yeah.
important thing that you've learned if you've been listening to the podcast today is you are certainly not alone.